Welcome everyone to our third and final LinkedIn Live session, where we've been discussing the proposed international standard on auditing for audits of less complex entities, or as we'll refer to them today, LCEs. My name is Bruce Vivian, and I'm a principal at IFAC, where I work in the quality and development team. And today I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm joined by three expert panelists who I'll introduce just briefly. Andrew Brathwaite. Andrew has been a member of the LCE reference group. This was a really important group that has been providing input as the standard has been developed. He's also a member of IFAC's SMP Advisory Committee, and he is a practitioner based in Barbados. Then we're joined by Julie Corden. Julie is a IAASB board member and has also been a member of the LCE task force. Julie is a practitioner with a Big Four accountancy firm and is based in Canada. And then finally, we're joined by Brendan Murtagh. Brendan has also been a member of the LCE task force. In his day job, he's a practitioner with a medium-sized firm in Dublin, Ireland. Brendan was previously an IAASB member and is in fact one of the longest standing members of the project group working on LCEs, so I'm sure he'll have some great perspectives for us. Now, at our previous sessions, we talked about the concepts that were used to develop the standard and when the standard can be used. If you did miss those sessions, I really encourage you to take a look at the recordings when you have time. They are available on the IAASB's LinkedIn page or on their YouTube channel. Today, we want to finish the series by diving into what the proposed standard might mean for firms and for practitioners. So firstly, we have seen that the differences between the full suite of ISAs and this separate standard maybe aren't quite as significant as some might have hoped. But nonetheless, there are great benefits that can come from this standard. So let's explore that question a little bit. Andrew, you gave input into the standard during its development as part of the LCE reference group. But you're also a practitioner doing audits. What are your thoughts on this question? Why would you say a firm or practitioner would want to use the standard when they're doing audits of less complex entities?
Thanks, Bruce. As you alluded to, the LCE standard as currently drafted does not reduce the amount of work that will have to be done. However, it should address several of the concerns that have been raised about the full suite of ISAs, and it does offer a number of advantages that will be attractive to firms and practitioners. Since the proposed standard is designed with the audit of an LCE in mind, it only contains requirements that would be relevant to those types of audits. This means that the standard is much shorter than the full suite of ISAs. The language used in the standard has been designed to be clear, understandable, and concise with minimal repetition. It follows the flow of the audit, and each part of the proposed standard includes the objectives to be achieved, along with specific communication and documentation requirements. It is therefore easier to read the standard and understand all of the requirements that are relevant to a specific audit without having to flip around to multiple sections and without having to read through pages of requirements that are not relevant. Practitioners can therefore focus their attention on the risks and appropriate procedures for that engagement. So they're not performing less work, performing the right work. And they can have greater confidence that they have identified all of the relevant requirements and are compliant with those requirements.
Apologies, I did click the unmute button and it didn't go off. So let me pick it up again. Andrew, thanks so much for that input. And one of the key takeaways I had from what you were sharing there was not less work, but the right work. So thanks really for sharing some of the positive aspects. And I can also kind of see just why so many of the IAASB stakeholders have expressed the need for its development. And I think it sounds like it's very responsive to those needs. Now, on our last LinkedIn Live session in October, we learned about when the proposed standard can be used and who makes those decisions. That discussion was around the very kind of high-level restrictions and prohibitions. And in that discussion, we learned the role kind of the international standards, then the restrictions and prohibitions that might happen at the jurisdiction level. But we also heard that firms and even practitioners at the engagement level have a role to play in deciding whether the standard can be used or not. Julie, you were on the task force developing the standard. Can you remind us of the role of the firm and the individual practitioner at the engagement level in deciding whether the standard can be used or not?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Bruce, and you're quite right. There is a role for the firm and the practitioner to play in determining whether they are able to use the standard. So if you think about from a firm perspective, and this assumes that they've been allowed to use the standard in their jurisdiction, the firms do need to create their own policies and procedures for use of the standard, quite the same as they would do today in determining, for their firm, what policies and procedures they have, what standards they follow, what methodologies they follow. It could be the case that a firm might decide not to use the LCE standard. That might be because they already have a methodology that they're comfortable with and that are using for those types of audits. Or maybe that firm wants to have a further restriction due to clients in a certain risk profile. So for instance, maybe there's a new industry that's sort of bubbling up out there, and the firm wants to ensure that while they might meet the definition of an LCE, maybe for a while until the firm has their arms around all those audits and how they work, they might want to have the full suite of ISAs used in the first place. So it could be very specific to the firm's set of engagements that they decide that. But I guess just one key point there is that firms can't override. You mentioned the jurisdictional restrictions. Firms can't override that. So they could further restrict. They can't go back and open things up. The engagement team also plays a role. So assuming you've worked through the other considerations and you're at the engagement team level, the engagement partner and the engagement team still needs to make an active determination about whether the standard is appropriate for the use in that specific engagement. And in the authority, there were qualitative considerations that engagement partner or team would use in order to make that judgment. So for instance, that is important because the engagement team and the engagement partner are very close to the engagement, and they would have intimate knowledge about the engagement, very specific characteristics of that engagement. And so they do need to make that determination as part of a couple of places within the audit. So they need to determine that initially when they accept or continue the engagement. And then in the standard, we've built in a stand back. And that stand back happens right after risk assessment procedures, right after you've gone through your robust risk assessment, you've thought about what all is contained in this audit, what the risks are, and you need to then stand back and just ensure, am I in the right place? And so that is a requirement in the standard itself. And then, of course, audits are iterative. Things happen. New information comes to light. And so the engagement team and the partner still needs to be aware of those things. And so to the extent that something might happen during the audit, or a new transaction might happen, or something that might indicate this is a more complex audit, they still need to think about that as the audit progresses.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julie. So it's interesting to hear then how this is not a decision that's set in stone at any one point, but there's constant thought from the auditor about whether they are applying the correct standard. Of course, this means that there's a lot of judgment involved, and I think that's what we're hearing. And certainly I've heard emerging concerns about the standard being used, perhaps inappropriately, because of the judgment involved. Brendan, you've been involved in developing the standard, but you're also a practicing auditor, and perhaps you may have concerns about this being a judgment. So maybe a couple of sort of questions to ask around this. Why the use of judgment? Why couldn't we just be more prescriptive and kind of clearly define the requirements? And then what sort of things should the auditor be thinking about as they make this judgment? And perhaps the most important part, what happens if the judgment is inappropriately made?
good questions, Bruce, and kind of go to the core of what we're trying to achieve here to a certain extent. When we looked at this at a reasonably early stage, we concluded that it wouldn't be appropriate to set thresholds at a global level. There are more than 130 countries using the ISAs at the moment, and these countries vary in size, the complexity of the markets, etc. So it would be very difficult, almost impossible, to establish a common threshold within the standard. You have some countries where a company might be a small company, but in another jurisdiction, it may very well be a very large company. And this had to be catered for. And this is the reason why we felt it was important to leave that judgment at the engagement level, so that the particular circumstances of the entity and the engagement could be factored into the decision on whether to use the standard or not. And it's important that in making that assessment, there is a requirement there to document why the engagement is being performed using the ISA for LCEs, and that will help other people understand why that judgment was made. In terms of the things the auditor should be thinking about in making that judgment, the standard gives some ideas of what drives complexity in the audit. It explains that this, and it also has some helpful examples in the supplemental material. Complexity can be one or more of a number of different things in an audit. And the sort of things that we've identified are things like accounting estimates, the business activity itself, maybe the business model or the industry it operates in. Also, the ownership structure or the organizational structure might actually drive complexity. And then you get into things like the IT environment, or indeed maybe specific transactions or the way they process information. So there's quite a bit there that needs to be considered. In terms of inappropriate use, if a decision is made to inappropriately use the ISA, this could result in the auditor not doing enough to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support the audit opinion. And this is because the standard doesn't contain all of the requirements of the ISAs for procedures for complex matters or circumstances. Therefore, if the standard is inappropriately used, it may not include all the procedures required to perform an audit. Another interesting aspect of the standard to remember is the concept of if in doubt, you're out. So if you're looking at the audit of a set of financial statements and you're not sure whether they would actually fall within the less complex entity criteria, well, then the standard just wouldn't be appropriate.
Fantastic. So if you're in doubt, you're out. And I suppose also in assessing complexity, it's not a simple process, which sounds obvious, right? And that's why we need this element of judgment. So, I want to now get a little more practical. Andrew, is there anything else the auditor should be thinking about from a practical perspective as they make these decisions?
Well, when assessing if it's appropriate to use the standard, the auditor would also consider the entity's future plans. So, for example, the entity might be intending to expand into more complex business operations or planning to implement a new complex IT system. So the types of things that Brendan just spoke about. This could mean that the standard may no longer be appropriate. So it's best to identify that as early as possible in the planning process to avoid having to transition out of the standard in the current period or even in the subsequent period. So you need to think about whether you want to be switching or whether you just want to stay in the full suite of ISAs. The auditor will also need to make sure that the client is comfortable with the use of the ISA for LCE and that its use will meet the needs of the users of the financial statements. This hopefully will largely be a matter of educating stakeholders about the standard and emphasizing that it is designed to provide a quality engagement, providing reasonable assurance, just like the full suite of international standards on auditing.
Fantastic. So I think that's such an important principle, right? That ultimately we are still trying to get to the same reasonable assurance through this process. Now, I wonder if we could just change track a bit. One of the important bits of feedback we want to be receiving on this draft from the community is sort of the challenges that may come about and the barriers to using the standard. So let's look at this from two perspectives. The first perspective, Judy, you have a background in a larger firm. As you're looking at it now, what would you say are some of the barriers or challenges you see large audit firms having in implementing the standard?
Sure, Bruce. And despite the fact that I sit in a large network with some large firms, we also have varying size of firms within our network. And I would think that that's pretty common around the world, that networks do have varying size. So they'll have to consider that. So differing sizes might be something, well, maybe not a barrier. It could be a challenge for firms to decide, the use of the standard and what makes sense from a global policy perspective. And I know a lot of firms out there right now are working through their ISQM1 implementation. So they're probably thinking about policies and procedures quite often, and firms will need to think about that as they work through it. Methodologies are big. Networks often have common methodologies, common tools. So they'll need to think about that as whether or not that creates a barrier. It might be a challenge that can be overcome, but it'll be something they'll need to think about, especially for firms that service, engagements at maybe both ends of the scale. So to the extent that a firm has large complex audits and a series of less complex audits, they'll have to think about how to service both of those populations. So does your methodology and tools, are they able to accommodate that? Would be something a firm will need to think about. And along with that comes, training, tools, other resources, I guess, you provide to your practitioners. How do you think about that? And will you need to think about that differently if you were to provide for the standard in your methodologies? Some networks also have existing methodologies. So to the extent that they need to be thought through again and maybe calibrated to what the new LCE standard looks like, that would be something for a firm to consider. It might be that they want to keep with their own and go that way and continue on because they're happy with that. It might be that some adjustments need to be made to their sort of small company or less complex methodologies. I know all networks have different names for that, but that would be something that a firm would need to consider as well. And then we've touched on it a couple times, but to the extent that something does happen and you need to transition out of the standard, that would be something firms would need to provide guidance for, I would expect, to their practitioners. What does that look like? How do you transition? I mean, just real practical things on the ground, suggestions that they'll need to provide to their practitioners, because we would hope that wouldn't be a common occurrence, but we do recognize that could happen from time to time. So those were some of the things that I can think of right now, Bruce, that we would be thinking about.
Fantastic. Thanks, Julia. It's really helpful to hear your perspective. And I think particularly what you started off by saying, that even though these network firms are larger in terms of, globally, there can be smaller practices within that network, which we shouldn't forget about. Let's then go to the other end of the market. Andrew, you were originally working as a partner for a Big Four firm, but you now run a small auditing and accounting practice that specializes in providing services for LCEs. And we know these types of smaller firms are critical components of any economy. So what kind of impact do you think this standard could make for smaller practices such as yours? And do you see some of the challenges that Julie described, maybe some different ones?
Well, I think the considerations for smaller practices will be similar to what Julie described. Many of these practices, though, probably have not developed their own audit methodology and use programs and templates from a third-party vendor or even from a professional accountancy organization. So they will be relying on those vendors to produce LCE versions of the various templates. So for example, the package that I currently use in my practice already has versions for small companies as opposed to large or medium-sized companies. So I would expect a similar approach. It is expected that the ISA for LCE should make tools and related guidance and training more concise and straightforward, given that the standard is easier to read and understand and only contains the procedures that are relevant. So it will be very interesting, I think, to see how internally developed LCE templates and those from third-party vendors differ from the small company templates that may already be in use by practitioners. Some smaller practices may may also be wondering whether they will be able to audit only LCE clients and therefore focus exclusively on the LCE standard. This, I think, may be difficult to achieve in practice, as the client's activities may change as we discussed earlier, and they may no longer qualify as an LCE. Practitioners will likely, therefore, have to be familiar with both the LCE standard and the full suite of ISAs and maintain practice aids for both, or templates that will bridge differences between the two.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And certainly we can see, I think, that there's a support structure that is around the smaller firms that will need to be responding, whether that's professional accountancy organizations or whether that's some of the service providers who work in the space, to ensure that this does actually have its intended impact. So thank you to you both. I just want to take note of all the great questions that are coming through in the chat. Some of them I know we're trying to respond to in writing live, but those that we aren't able to, we will be responding to after this session. Now, the exposure draft is currently open for comments until January 31st, 2022, so we're about 2.5 months away from that deadline. It was a deliberately longer than normal time period that the IAASB has given, and so we really want to encourage as many of you to participate in that comment process, and especially to submit, formal comment letters. But this week we also have published as IFAC and the IAASB a special survey which can assist in stakeholders providing feedback, particularly those stakeholders who might not have the time to do a full written comment letter. So I really want to encourage all of you to consider that as a mechanism, either for yourself or for your stakeholders, depending on your role. I'll talk a little bit more about the survey at the end. But Brendan, why is it so important to get feedback on this draft from firms and practitioners that actually work with less complex entities? And what would you say some of the sort of most key feedback that the IAASB is looking to receive?
Bruce, feedback on this project is going to be one of the key success factors. When we were developing this, both the task force and the board felt that it was important to expose the standard for a longer period of time, given the nature and importance of this project. To assist with this, we've also translated the standard and guidance into French and Spanish, and there are other jurisdictions which are also undertaking translations, because we want to ensure that we reach as many people as possible with this consultation. One of the most important groups that we need to hear from are those who are actually providing services to LCEs. This is a group that we don't normally hear from and who may not have the resources or time to provide comment letters. And for this reason, we're undertaking significant outreach to this group as part of our outreach program and roundtables and other events to ensure that we're hearing what they have to say. What we really need to hear from people who are working with audits of LCEs, because they are doing it on a day-to-day basis and really understand this space. To understand if the proposed standard can be effectively used for audits of LCEs and address some points such as, are the procedures appropriate to these types of audits? Is there too much in the standard, or do we need to reduce the amount of content in the standard? Is the essential explanatory material sufficient and appropriate? Is the supplemental guidance sufficient? We also need to understand if the role of the auditor and the firms is clear. Also, is it appropriate that it's a standalone standard rather than having reference back to the actual ISA, full ISAs themselves? There are a couple of other things in the standard. One of particular interest is around group audits. We haven't at this point included it, and we need to understand if people think it should be included or excluded. And if we are to include it, how should we go about including it? And then we also need to hear if this standard is actually going to be used by practitioners, and if not, why not? And that kind of information will help us develop the path forward for this project.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brendan. And really just thank you to all of our panelists today, both for your perspectives today, but also for the great work you've been doing in driving the development of the standard to the point it is now, as well as your colleagues who've been involved who aren't with us today. This has been a really interesting discussion, and I hope those watching have gained a bit of clarity around what this standard is going to mean for firms and practitioners. As I mentioned, we will respond to any questions you've raised on the LinkedIn page after this session. I mentioned the survey earlier. I should highlight that the survey is also available in French and Spanish, in addition to the English version. And we really want to encourage everyone to provide their feedback. And this includes whether you agree or whether you disagree, even if it's just to send a response, say, hey, this is great. Or just if you have one or two comments, to send those through, whether it be through the survey or through a formal comment letter. Those are really important perspectives. And please share this consultation amongst your community. As you've heard, we want to hear from the practitioners who are going to be using this. We want to be hearing from preparers. We want to hear from those who will use the financial statements and the audit reports. So we really want to get this as wide as possible. A reminder that this session has been recorded, and so it'll be available after this on both the IAASB LinkedIn page as well as on their YouTube channel, along with the recordings from our previous sessions. There is a dedicated page on the IAASB website for this LCE project. It's got a huge amount of resources, so if you want to get to that, you just go to the IAASB website, and the most prominent link you see on that page currently is the link to the LCE page. Please go on there to find the exposure draft, to find other resources, videos of these session recordings, the survey link, and other resources. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking your time out, both to listen, but also hopefully to submit your comments and be a part of this consultation. Please do participate in this consultation. We believe the standard has the potential to have a great impact on our profession and on our economies. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your